After more than a month of being under lockdown, the UK government finally lifted some of the rules restricting what the British people could and could not do just last week, or just over last week, I think. I was quite surprised by how many people I saw out and about, just sort of hanging around in, still social distancing, but the difference in the fully locked down period compared to when some of the restrictions were lifted was noticeable. And it made me think about how the British people are kind of known for following rules, I think, a little bit. British people, we're said to love to queue up, or to be good at it at least, to keep some kind of order by enforcing these sort of social etiquette rules without having to use the hard enforcement of the police. We use social shaming to keep each other in check and to make sure that everyone else is following the rules. And the extent to which individuals in England and in Britain do that, who like to follow the rules, it varies from person to person, obviously. But it's my understanding that people in other countries view us Brits in that way, at least, and I think there is some truth to it. What I have a hard time figuring out is whether that is a good trait or not. It's certainly nice to live in a community where everybody is following the laws of the land, and on top of that, following some social etiquette rules that keep everybody in behaving nicely to each other, but without having to actually legally enforce any of these social etiquette rules. You get to live in a very safe society, a very safe community, but also a kind of friendly one where you can trust each other beyond just trusting somebody not to steal from you or to murder you. And in addition, you get to enjoy the order that comes from a nice orderly queue at the local bakery, instead of having to sort of shove your way to the front and hold your place. There are obviously advantages to being in a place where people follow the rules, and yet that only applies to places where the rules are appropriate and when they are enforced fairly, but not, and I don't mean fairly as in equally, although that is, one dimension of fairness. I mean not imposed rigidly. There's some leeway that takes into account the circumstances. When rules are applied with no heed to the context, when they're applied unilaterally without any view to extenuating circumstances, it's usually called pedantry. That's sort of the negative way of describing it. Someone is said to be pedantic if they are vigilant about enforcing rules to the letter of the rule and not paying attention to the nuances or the spirit of the rule. And just like with all characteristics, the characteristic of being orderly or following rules can be taken to an extreme where it becomes no longer a virtue but a vice, or perhaps not a vice, but it's a hubris. It's the opposite. It's a bad thing. It's not a virtue. But there's also this other way that we can characterize rule following as a negative thing rather than as a positive thing, and that is when you follow the rules out of weakness, not out of virtue. I talked a little bit about this in a video, I don't even remember, something about masculinity, but this came up in an episode of the Spiked podcast that I was listening to with Lionel Shriver.
And you have talked about the supine capitulation to a police state that has happened in the UK over the past few weeks. Do you think it's that bad? Do you think it's not only so bad that we have a police state, but it's even worse because everyone has capitulated to it in a rather craven fashion?
I think it's pretty depressing. I've come across in more than one article a reference to how free-thinking and independently minded we think of the British people. And I don't think that this situation bears that out.
Where she described the British people as kind of very meek, and I think she described us as sheep a few times for going along with these lockdown rules that the government was enforcing. I think what she was saying is that when we defer our decisions to an authority figure, we are giving up some of our own autonomy. We become less like adults and more like children who are just doing what our parents say because they are bigger and smarter than us. And so, as with many matters that I discuss on this channel, I'm in two minds on the subject. I can see both sides of this characterization. I look at the people in my community who did what they were told and stayed at home. They didn't see their families. They didn't go out to socialize at all. We all stayed in and went to our little Zoom meetings and Skype meetups. And then when the government said that it was all right to do so, we came out a little bit and started to talk to our neighbours again, and we started using the public spaces again and enjoying the sunshine. And I can see the benefit of that. And before I go any further into talking about the ethics of the lockdown and about self-isolating and social distancing, I'd like to point out a nuance that I've seen a lot of other people talking about this subject missing. Some of the commentators who are more, shall I say, freedom orientated, they're more libertarian and less on board with the lockdown. They characterize the threat from catching the virus as one that you are taking on to yourself, and that it's therefore your decision to make about how much risk you want to take with your own life and your own health. But catching the coronavirus also has a negative externality, meaning that there is a downside to catching the virus that is not felt by you, and you will never experience any of the direct consequences, negative consequences of these negative externalities. In this case, it refers to the tendency for you to pass on the virus to people who otherwise wouldn't have caught it, or who would have caught it later than they will now because you're passing it to them. Nobody can perfectly isolate themselves. Everybody needs to have some point of contact with the outside world, and so the cleaner we can keep the outside world that people come into contact with, the safer everybody who comes into contact will be. And so it's the place of the government to issue these guidelines and advice on how we should be conducting ourselves, so that we can protect ourselves but also to protect each other. And I'm not in a position to say whether it's an effective means of doing so, or if it's a, should I say, efficient way of doing so. But I think the British people's will to make self-sacrifices for the benefit of the larger community, I think, is admirable. But there's also a darker side to it that I brought up earlier in the form of pedantry. And I think we saw this in the last few days when the story of Dominic Cummings, the advisor to Downing Street. Dominic Cummings has been widely criticised over the last few days for driving his family to Durham, which was over 200 miles away from London. And he did this to make sure that there would be somebody to take care of his son if he and his wife both came down with the virus, which indeed they did. I won't go into all of the details, as everybody who's already heard of this story probably knows a lot more of the details than I'm willing to go into here anyway. And if you're not familiar with the story already, I'll try to give you the relevant details so you understand this video, but I urge you, if you are interested, to look into the full details. As an advisor to the Prime Minister and to the government, Dominic Cummings was kind of responsible for some of these lockdown rules. He's seen as a public figure who is an authority on the subject, and so when he defied the rules in order to take his son 200 miles away while the government was telling everybody to stay at home, it's seen as hypocritical. He's telling the British public to do one thing while doing another himself. Earlier today, I watched him give his statement at Downing Street, where he explained in great detail everything that he did and why he did it. He wanted to make sure there was somebody to take care of his son, and instead of looking for somebody in London, a friend or a neighbour, he decided to take the help of the people in his life who were already volunteering to help him, who were his nieces and his grandparents. The grandparents of his son, who were his parents. And in order to do that, he had to violate this policy against travelling. The government's rules at the time, which have now been lifted slightly, as I mentioned at the start of this video, the rules at the time and these rules were only to be violated if it was in service of protecting somebody who is vulnerable. And since Dominic Cummings was taking care of his son, making sure that his son could be taken care of, he says that he did nothing wrong, and he would not apologise, despite the long line of journalists who were lining up to ask him whether he apologised, whether he regretted it, whether he thought he operated under a different set of rules to everyone. He stood his ground and defied all of them. I don't know if everything he said in his statement was true, or if it gave the whole picture of events, but if he is being completely honest about the details of his journey and his return journey, I think I probably would have done the same thing that he did in his situation. Where Dominic Cummings and I differ in our behaviour is our ability to withstand social pressure, I think. If I were in his position, I think I would have wilted under the pressure to apologise and to resign a long time ago. But he stands by his actions and he won't apologise for them. And I find that kind of inspiring. And I know there'll be people watching this who don't agree with me, who believe that he was, flaunting his own rules. And I think the important thing to remember is that all rules have a limit to how they're imposed, and there's always extenuating circumstances that allow an exception to a rule. Where people differ is how rigidly they expect others to follow the rules. Under what circumstances is any particular rule allowed to be broken? If everybody could be trusted to defer to their own judgment all the time on every matter, we wouldn't need rules at all. I think it speaks to human nature that we need rules that we all recognise and share. We all know that we share these rules, and so we can expect others to, when we behave in front of people, we have some kind of working model of how we think that person is thinking of us in that moment. And that helps us to make ethical decisions, or it helps us to make practical decisions, perhaps. When we are alone and feel like we're not being watched, we tend to make decisions that are more based on our own self-interest. But now I'm getting very much off topic, and I haven't made a video in a while, and I just wanted to get this out there. Sorry if it was a little disjointed, but I of course want to hear what you think on all of this. Do you come from a country where people follow the rules? What do you think of England and Britain if you're not from here? What is our reputation for queuing and rule following? And if you're from Britain, you've probably heard about the Dominic Cummings story and have your own view on it, so I'd love to hear that. And thank you very much for watching. I will see you again soon.